Welcome and thank you for coming to the third session of our legal seminar series. Today we'll be discussing policies and procedures. As a little bit of background, we started out with talking about governing documents and incorporating documents. In other words, what it takes to incorporate a church, and then other documents that it takes to run the church. Now we're going to be talking about, if you think of like how to build a house, these are kind of more like the nuts and bolts of holding a house together, or maybe some finishing touches or the like. So with that, my name is Brian Davis. This is Gary McCann. We are the legal team for the Utah-Idaho Southern Baptist Convention, and we are happy to be here today to present on policies and procedures. But before we get started, I'd like to say a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to come together and to learn what we can do to help make our churches better. God, I know that at this point in our presentation that we're starting to move in a direction that there's not a clear word from you, God. So I just pray that in this presentation, God, that your Holy Spirit, that it be here, God, that it be over us, and that it guide us and it show us what it is that we need to do to make our churches a place of organization, a place of safety, a place where people feel that they are comfortable and can come and worship, know that they're part of a family, and that family is going to protect them and look out for them. I just thank you for everybody that's here today and people joining us online, and for people who will be watching this recording later, God. Thank you for the blessing of technology to be able to share these policies and procedures presentation with the multitude. We ask that you use this to build your kingdom and your kingdom only. In Jesus' name, amen.
The first topic we want to address would be policies. And the question is, why? Why policies? Quick back thought. Governing documents are those legal papers that help you organize and structure your church and all of the things we talk about. The intention is not just to have a clear understanding of what the law is, but to understand that these things are all intended to encourage and enable the church to perform and fulfill its mission. So as we look at the background, again, the legal documents would include articles of incorporation by which the church is incorporated, becomes a legal entity. You have bylaws, which are guidelines for administrative purposes and all. And today we're going to talk about policies. Policies get more detailed, make it down to more specific ways to handle specific situations. It's much like if you get a handbook or a manual for your new computer. It'll give you a general description. This is a computer and here's what it does. And then it'll break it into chapters and say there are certain functions. Now we're getting down to the details. How do you perform certain tasks, certain things you want to do? So if you look at why, let me also indicate that one of the phrases you can use, we borrow from the movies, who are you going to call? If you have legal issues, legal questions, legal team's here for you to answer questions and to look into things. Now let's take a look at the why. And we've listed some things. By the way, these are not all inclusive. The slides don't cover everything, but we're looking at what's critical, what's important. First thing is bylaws provide structure and guidance. Second thing, it helps with risk management issues. Now we're going to be having a session on risk management, and bylaws and policies are helpful tools. And the key there is follow your bylaws, follow your policies. Policies help you equip and prepare your leaders, your volunteers, your workers, helps them to understand what they are supposed to be doing, what they can do, what they cannot do, and it provides them more or less a structure to be able to work with whatever other ministries are going on and how you relate to one another. The last thing on the point here is this helps with continuity. And that's an important thing. If you have a policy in place, it means that generally speaking, you would be following the same procedure in similar situations, and you don't have to go back and redo, refix, rewrite things. You've got a continuity. And that helps that if somebody has been acting, for instance, as a teacher, and they're not a teacher this year, but next year they come back. The policy there helps provide that continuity, that they know what they're doing, what's expected. But part of the policies are to make sure that they're known and that they are adopted by your church body and that you follow them. So at any rate, the why is to be something that helps you in details. And we're going to be talking about specific areas at this point. And as we do that, we'll turn time over here now to Brian to talk about the next aspect.
Yeah, just to piggyback onto what Gary's talking about, these policies and procedures that we're recommending, that they are just that, they're just recommendations. And the purpose of them is just to give you an idea of things to think about. It's not saying that you must have this. It's not saying that you have to have it in this way, because every church is different. Every church is going to have a different issue. So, but this is something that we see over and over again. So these are good things to be thinking about. And in discussing continuity, children. Most churches are going to have children. And when you have children and you have workers going in and out, it's good to know what are the responsibilities of the people who will be teaching the children. What rules are you going to have in place to make sure your children are protected? So with that, let's go over a few of things that we recommend being in a policy or procedure as far as it concerns children. First, background checks. Background checks is a way for your church to run a background on someone who wants to work with children and find out if they have any criminal convictions, and to find out what those convictions are, right? Someone may be convicted of a small misdemeanor crime of shoplifting. Maybe that's something that your church finds is not a big issue as far as dealing with the children. You may also find that the person is a sexual predator, in which case you do not want that person around the children. So that's where these background checks come in handy. One thing to note with background checks, they usually only find criminal information. There's no civil information that is usually listed on these background checks. And sometimes information that is not always, you're not always going to find all the information on a background check, because you have different levels. You have state background checks, federal background checks, you can have tribal background checks. And then even within that, each state has their own rules as far as what will be on the background check, what comes off a background check, what's been expunged. So it's important to think about this, talk to your legal department or talk to us about maybe what level of backgrounding you want to do, if we have any recommendations as far as a company, state, federal, and the like. Coming out of background checks is monitoring. What are your policies as far as monitoring children? My church, we have the ability to have cameras and technology to help alleviate the monitoring, so we don't need multiple people in a room. We also have windows in all the doors so people can come in and look. Maybe your church doesn't have that, right? Maybe your church has solid wood doors and you need 2 people in there to monitor to make sure your children are safe. These are things that you can be putting into your policies and procedures just so everybody knows what the church is doing to protect the children. First aid. What are the first aid requirements for your volunteers? Do they need to know CPR? Do they need to know basic first aid? Do they know where the first aid kit is at? Do they know, even within the first aid kit, what's actually involved, what actually is in that first aid kit? While we hope that no child is ever hurt while they're under the church's care, accidents do happen. Sometimes a kid is running and bonks their head and there's blood. So it's one of those things where having a policy and procedure in place as far as what the expectations are for your workers when there is blood is important. And then on top of that, not only having these policies in place, but also telling your teachers in the room where they can find these policies if they want to look at them, and training them to make sure they know what to do in these situations. It's the same thing with food. What food are you going to allow in the classrooms? In today's world, we're learning more and more about allergies. So there are safe foods and there are not safe foods. You can have a peanut allergy that is so severe that even the smell of peanuts can set a kid into anaphylactic shock. So maybe peanuts, not a great thing to have in the classroom. There are other snack options that you can have, but we need to be careful about what food allergies we have And maybe you want something in place to have parents notify you of what your kids' allergies are. Again, our church, on the labels for the kids, it says what the food allergies are. So that way the workers know, oh, this kid, for example, my kid had an egg allergy for 2 years. The workers were very good about making sure that nothing with eggs got to my kids. I appreciate that. That's something that if policies and procedures can help make sure that is listed, so that way they know what to do. Same thing with diapers. Do you want your workers changing dirty diapers or no? Do you want them to call for the parents? What's going to be the policy? What is the process to go get the parents? Is it going to be buzzers, or is it going to be notifications on a board, someone going to the service and finding the parent? Again, these are just things, helpful ideas. Drop off and pick up. What are the rules for dropping off a child? What are the rules for picking up the child? Generally speaking, you want the parent dropping off the child and that same parent or their spouse picking up the child. Maybe you have a tag in place that will help them know that this child matches the parent's tag, right? Maybe your church is small enough, you don't really need that, right? Because you're small enough and you know everybody. That's okay. But it's just good to have the policy in place that people know what their expectations are. Discipline. What are the rules for disciplining children? This runs the gamut. Some people believe that spanking is an okay form of punishment or discipline. Some people don't. Some people believe that timeout is an okay form of discipline. Some people don't. I won't get into what I think is appropriate or not, but you as a church body should have that discussion and make sure your teachers know what are the expectations when a kid is in need of discipline. And then what are you going to do when the parents come and pick up their child? Are you going to notify them of the discipline? Are you just going to let it go? What happens when the parent comes back and says, hey, you disciplined my kid, I want to know more? These are things that if you have a good policy in place, your workers will know how to respond and how to react. And lastly, disputes. What happens when a parent does come to you as the pastor and says, hey, this teacher is teaching something I don't agree with, or this teacher is disciplining my child in a way I don't agree with? What are you as a pastor going to do? How are you going to respond? Do you have a policy in place that says, okay, we're going to handle this biblically, right? Or are you going to handle it in a different way? What happens if that parent doesn't go to you, pastor, but goes to maybe your deacon? Or maybe they go to another church council member or staff member or whatever title you want to give that person. Does that person know that they need to address it with you, pastor? Or do you have some other mechanism to address that issue? Again, these are just all things to be thinking about as you're drafting and creating these policies and procedures. And we're happy to come along beside you and help you with that. But these are some of the major areas in which you could see how a dispute quickly break out, or how an emergency can break out and you need to know how to respond.
A couple of points there, and understanding children are very important to their parents, and they want to have the confidence that their children are going to be taken care of, that they're receiving the right care, the right teaching, the right conditions. So part of it is, as you're training your volunteers and you're going over policies and procedures with them, include the parents, educate the parents on that, and provide them copies so that they are aware and their expectations can be a little bit more optimistic on their part, that they can feel, yes, it's good to bring our children there, we feel good. And you may have a registration system as children are brought in. That's where identification, either bracelets or pins or whatever might come in. But you need to know which kids are in your care. So you need to keep track of them. And one of the basics is, you don't want to lose a child. You don't want to lose one. You don't want to be at the end of the day and everybody's gone and the parents are saying, where's Billy? So these are things that you need to be really looking at carefully. And as Brian said, there's so many more things. But the idea is take care of the children as though they were your own.
Ultimately, what we care about is the safety of the children, because you parents and pastors, you're discipling the next generation. And if that next generation does not feel safe in your building, does not feel that they can learn about Jesus in your building, they are going to leave the building and not believe in Jesus. And that is worse than anything that can happen in your building. Is if that child goes, because of my church that I grew up in, I don't believe in Jesus. We don't want that. We want a safe place for your children to come and learn about Jesus, so that way they may hopefully call him Abba the way we all do.
Taking the next step and incorporating what we've just been talking about is the notion on the next slide about safety and security. And of course, there's a lot about the security of the child, but there are other considerations when it comes to security that you need to be thinking about. The first one here that's listed on the slide is access to the buildings or grounds. So one of the questions is, who has access? Particularly if you have a church secretary who's there by herself, who has access? How can people get in if she's there? She needs to be safeguarded. There needs to be ways to identify. But who can come onto the grounds? And part of that will be also, it can be, for instance, during a church service or activity, Awanas clubs or whatever. You can well have a situation where there's a couple that's been divorced. One parent, the mother will say, is the custodial parent. The father is not the custodial parent, but the father wants to come and get the children, or the father wants to come and make a fuss about it. And that can happen easily. So you have to look at access in a variety of ways, but you want to be sure who has actual access to getting in, and recognizing that that's not just when you're there, but when you're not there. What mechanisms do you have in place, whether it's cameras or otherwise, to be sure who's coming in? A part of the access also deals with who are you going to allow to come in? What groups do you want to come in, and what groups are you going to be cautious about? And you need to be able to address that. Moving over here, surveillance, that's getting down to where you have cameras, but also where you have people observing and watching. And as Brian mentioned, one of the good things, like you just look at the doors here, if they have a window on, somebody ought to be walking around, looking in the window from time to time, just to make sure everything is all right. But so you want to have a certain amount of overview. For surveillance, you want to be sure that somebody knows what's happening. You don't want to be surprised saying, gee, I didn't know the class was outside, for example. And gee, I didn't know the kids were going to be left alone to play out there by themselves. Or a typical example, I shouldn't say typical, but a classic example is you have a hot summer day in the middle of July, and some fella comes in with a hoodie and a long black trench coat on, and he's got a rifle under his jacket. There should be some reason to suspect a problem, and you want to address that. You want to be prepared for it. So surveillance means keeping an eye open for all aspects. Medical incidents, things can happen, and whether it's a child or an adult. At the Dog Days event just at Mountain View this last week, a lady fell on the front step going in. And fortunately, the 2 or 3 of us were right there and were able to help. Medical incidents can help. But if you're going to help, you ought to be trained. And we would really encourage every church to have first aid training, first aid that deals with children, infants, and adults, and seniors. And to have that CPR training at each of those levels. The church ought to have an AED for fibrillation issues, and people trained to do it. Now, with those devices, essentially you pull it off the wall, push the button, and it tells you what to do. But sometimes when there's an incident, you've got 10 people telling you what to do, or you just can't hear any of it. You need to have that training. So you want to be sure if there is a medical incident that somebody who knows what they're doing can take charge. Other people need to be ushered back, stay back, don't get in the way, and then keep a record of what was done and what was said. A basic factor in terms of legal issues is you do not provide first aid or medical attention or help beyond your level of training. So don't attempt to do something that you're not trained with. Next one, active shooter. The thing across the country, we're seeing so much of this. And what will most churches say? Never here. It'll never happen here. But in all the churches where it's happened, almost all of them are small churches, small groups. And so you need to be prepared. And that will call for some special training. And there are places that are available to help you. On our website, there's material there. It needs to be updated because there's a lot of agencies and people who can provide either through video or live presentations how to handle an active shooter. In this respect, there's just certain things to be aware of, and how to not only avoid, but when it does occur, what do you do? No different than what's happening in schools, for example. They're having to have that kind of training. Natural disasters, storms, floods, tornadoes, things can happen. Where I came from in Florida, hurricanes was a way of life. You always had to be ready. But what happens when a natural disaster occurs? Parents will want to come grab their children. So if it's on a night when the youth are meeting, parents will want to come there, and that might not be the best thing. But if something happens, they have to know that the children are going to be handled, the youth or whoever, is going to be handled in a proper way. And there are processes that they ought to follow, just safety, common sense things when an emergency happens. Just out here, for instance, on the street that this church is located on. What would happen if there was major flooding or those high canyon winds, those easterly mountain winds that comes down? There's going to be a lot of traffic out here, and you may not be able to get anywhere. So you have to be prepared to act where you are. Do you have people, if there's high winds, get under the table? Do you have where do you have them go? So be prepared and be just prepared for it. First aid kits, even water, but have things ready. Facility maintenance and code compliance. This is a major one, really major. I would say, and I don't want to attach a percentage, but great many of our churches have the belief that building codes, electric codes, water codes they're not, that has nothing to do with the church. We don't need to comply with those. And so they will do makeshift approaches. When you have something like that, what happens if there's an electrical fire? What happens if there's flooding? Whatever it is, code compliance. As a church, it may be considered a public accommodation, meaning the public's invited in. You have to be able to meet the code levels for those people that you're expected, from the parking lot on inside. Now, a couple other things I want to mention to you in terms of security and safety. One is, I think each church ought to have people who are identified, who are trained, and can act as a security team. And you'll have to have a policy in place that addresses that. For example, who would comprise that team? What is their task? What are their limitations? Do you want them to carry weapons or not? What do you want them to do if there is a weapon presented? So you want to have those things addressed. I would encourage you as a church, contact your local law enforcement agency, whether it's the sheriff's office or the city police. Have them review with you what to do in terms of different situations, but also ask them to come out and evaluate your facility. What do you have? What are the danger spots? What are the risky spots? Where could improvements be made? Then the last thing I'd like to mention here is your insurance carrier will have a great deal of interest in what you're doing in terms of security and safety. Talk with them, make sure what is covered under your policy that would, if you have a third party intervening on the campus, for instance. But also they will have resource information to you. I want to say it's specific ministry. I think that's the correct word for it, term for it. They provide training, videos, and all, a lot of good resources. Your churches should turn to whoever the insurance carrier is, makes them sure that they know what you are doing safety-wise. A couple reasons. One, they may have a better idea, but secondly, you don't want them to say, I didn't know you were doing this, and so you're not covered. So with all that in mind, safety and security, a lot more details can come up, but there are experts out there. There are people that you can bring in that can help you out. And you never want to take safety and security lightly. So with that, we'll turn it over now to Brian.
All right, the next topic is the dreaded technology. So with technology is again another one of those big topic areas. We're only going to hit it briefly. There are things that you probably be thinking about later. But the first thing to keep in mind here is who has access to your technology? Do you have a soundboard? Is that soundboard connected to your internet? Who has access to that internet and those computers? Are you giving your pastors or your elders or your deacons, are you giving them cell phones or computers? If you are, what are the rules with that? Are they allowed to use it for personal or are they not? Are you asking your people to put an app on their personal device? If so, who gets to control that? When I worked at one of my former employers, they had an app. I think it was, if I recall correctly, it was a security app to access their website. And the app gave the business the authority to wipe the phone because the person had her company emails on the phone. IT accidentally wiped her phone one day. So like these are things that you need to be asking yourself and thinking about in your policies and procedures. Say, if we give you technology, these are the rules and the parameters in which you can use it. The same thing goes with internet usage. The internet is this great, wonderful, scary place. And it's important to say where someone can and can't go on the internet. Unfortunately, there are a lot of sites out there that will be used to download viruses, ransomware, Trojan horses onto your computers. And if you're not telling your people when they're jumping on the internet to maybe grab a song that they want to play at service, that they can't go to certain sites, you may be accidentally downloading a virus or some ransomware, and that may take down your church entirely. Other issues are fraud. Phishing scams happen all the time. You need to be on the watch for this. And the way phishing scams usually work is someone looks like they're pretending to be someone who they aren't, right? So for example, if you were to get an email from the UISBC, they usually will have some sort of misspelling in the domain name, right? Instead of the UISBC, it will be the UISBCA, right? They'll add a letter, they'll take away a letter, they'll change some letter. So if you're not careful, if you're not telling your people and your policies and procedures that you need to be careful on where your emails are coming from, what they can and can't open up on emails, you may accidentally allow someone into your system that you don't want there. And it's especially dangerous with ransomware because the way ransomware works is they take over your system and they make you pay to get your system back, or you have to go buy a whole new domain and start over. Social media. Social media, again, is another one of those things where it's a great, wonderful way to tell people about Jesus. It's also a way to get stuck in a quagmire. If you get into a debate with somebody online, if you start getting into political issues that may or may not be connected to the church or any issues the church would usually present on, I think it's important to have a policy and procedure in place as far as if you have social media, what can someone put on social media on behalf of your church? Because if you don't have some sort of parameters or guidelines for that, someone's going to put something out there that maybe you, pastor, disagree with. And if that happens, you may accidentally find yourself in the middle of a social media nightmare. You don't have to look very far to see this happens all the time. And so having a policy and procedure in place as far as what someone can say on behalf of your church through social media is very, very important. And finally, data storage, right? Where can data be stored? Can it be stored on your hard drives on your computer? Can they be stored in the cloud? There are issues with both, but these are just things that you might want to consider and work through.
I might mention too that you need to be careful with your emails, and in particular, who you're copying and what attachments you're putting onto it. One of the things might be, for example, you're have something confidential, something about a particular person, and you decide you want to send it out to your deacons. What if one of those deacons then forwards it on, or you have included somebody besides the deacon and materials going out. You've got to be careful about what goes out and what attachments, because there may be, like I say, a bug in the attachment. So be careful what you're doing that way. Okay, the next slide we're dealing with is financial. And I'd have to say here, financial concerns are often the cause of much grief in one way or another. And in the chapel devotion this week, I used the phrase, unclear expectations create distrust. So when you're dealing with finances, make sure that any expectations are very clear. And some of the places to start, some of the sub items here, collections, simple thing. How is money received? Well, typically cash or checks, but now online. You've got to be sure, how are they received? How are they counted? How are deposits made? Who is responsible for that? You always want to have at least two people if they're handling cash and checks and even overseeing deposits. You want to have that double thing, but then you deal with the issues of confidentiality. You want to make sure that the giving, is received money, but then with that money will be coming in, and we're going to get into this now, is designated giving. If, for example, your church collects money for the Annie Armstrong offering, well, that money coming in is designated for that, and you have to have a way to be sure where it goes, if there's an accounting for that. And simple accounting principles apply here, and common sense. But when you're looking at designated giving, be aware that you need to know what the conditions are that you're accepting that for. It's hard if you're a small church and someone says, I'm going to give you $10,000. It's very hard to say no. But if they have a little thing on there that says, I don't want you to talk about missions. I don't want you to talk about salvation, or I want you to use some other source that you don't want to use. That's a condition you don't want to accept. You have to be prepared to evaluate what the gift is that's coming in, what the designation is, and does it fit with who you are? So, for example, someone says presidential campaigns are getting underway already. So I want to give you $10,000 for you to put into the Donald Trump campaign. That's not a proper designation. You don't want to get into that, but make sure that you know what the designation is. But if you accept it, honor the designation, honor what the purpose is for that, and be ready to refuse a gift if you don't want to live with the condition. Understand that the IRS and state laws also deal with such things as what's an allowed deduction for giving. And sometimes you have to be very careful on the designations. As an example, if I were going to be joining a church team to go on mission, I could say to people in the church, please give money to the church, but put it for my name. That doesn't make it a deductible gift. So you have to be sure that you're educating people, and if they give a check to you that you have questions about, then just be cautious with it. Audits generally where you have a third party come in, a CPA or a big bookkeeper, who goes through your books and makes sure, first one, that the numbers are accurate, secondly, that they are in the correct places where they need to be, and that they're following good accounting principles. And one of the easiest things to do is to put something in the wrong box on Excel. You have to be able to watch where these things go, and that's where an auditor can come in. But as a third party, he can give assurance to you and your church and anybody dealing with the church that you're honest, straightforward, and competent in the way you handle the funding. So I think that's good there. Now, what happens with designated giving, by the way, I forgot to mention this. If you want to apply the funds differently, you got to go to the person who gave it and say, here's what we want to do. Confidentiality. People vary on this. I've talked to pastors. They want to know what every single church member or any other individual is giving. I tell them that's not good. You don't want to know. It should be kept strictly confidential. You don't want to have a chart on the wall of which families give which monies. You want to keep it confidential. And there are other things that will come up that, engender confidentiality. Budgets. Anybody here use a budget? Most churches do. And the problem with budgets is not that you have them, but sometimes they're not always followed or they're not always clear. But also, importantly, people think you can't change them. During the course of the year, whether in terms of what income comes in or what expenses arise, you need to be able to adjust the budget and to make it more realistic and workable. To do that, you have a process, and your bylaws will tell you how to do that, or your financial policy will say how you can do that. Spending. Okay, simple question. Who can spend the money? Who in your church is authorized to spend the money? And are there limitations on that? Some churches, for example, will say, well, all right, the pastor can spend money, but if it's an expenditure of over $1,000, he has to run it past a budget committee or get church approval. Or if it's for certain things like buying land or whatever, or selling off some assets, there's a process or limitations. So you want to be sure that you consider any authorizations or limitations that you want to put in and then follow them. But it has to be clear who can spend it. And then on the spending, receipts. I'll repeat that. Receipts. Keep a record of what is spent and where it goes and why. Okay, coming down to the last category, a subcategory here under financial. And by the way, all these things need to be addressed in your policies. And you have to write your policies so they're in plain English and that people can understand them. And anyway, in terms of contracts, I'm particularly concerned with contracts. Sometimes, and this is just a Gary saying, sometimes some of these things are too important to leave it up to the pastor. Okay. We assume that a pastor, because he's a pastor, automatically knows everything about business or how to handle contracts or how to handle arrangements. And that's not always so. Some are very good at it. Some churches don't have anybody that knows how to handle things. But you want to have a process in place and be able to look at contracts. Make sure that they are read before you sign them. Make sure that the contract, that what you need to know is in writing. If it's not in writing, in a legal sense, it didn't happen. And use common sense with the contracts. Sometimes churches will enter into a contract that leaves the door wide open to problems that they don't need to have. One example might be it could be some service online or whatever that automatically renews, and you start getting billed for things that you didn't want renewed. Look at those things. When does the contract expire? When's it renewable? How's that done? And then the other aspect of this is to understand that contracts, and particularly the larger ones, in particular ones dealing with land or lawsuits or whatever, the trustees or directors will play a role in that. And that's part of what their task is. So your policies ought to reflect what matters, contracts and so forth, should the trustees be reviewing, what should be referred to them. It's not that they make the decisions, but they can make recommendations and they can say, this is not a good idea or whatever. But involve them. And overall, just look at financially, whose money is it to begin with? It's the Lord's money. So we want to honor him and handle it in the right way and do things for the right reasons.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, right? The policies and procedures that we're recommending and talking about right now, it sounds like legalese, but at the end of the day, we're recommending these because it helps keep your church functioning and open so that way you can carry on your mission, right? Which is spreading the gospel, telling people about Jesus, letting people know that you're a place that they can come to and find out more about who Jesus is. And that's the whole purpose of these policies and procedures. So if you see one that you're saying, oh yeah, that's something good that will help us, great. If you're seeing something that saying, well, we're not there yet, that's fine as well. Just keep in mind that these are just to help you and spreading the gospel. So the next one is transportation. Transportation issues happen all the time. The first one is what happens when you have a church-sponsored event. Let's just say your church decides to hold a camping trip out in the woods, and your pastors and your youth leaders are all saying, okay, well, we're gonna take all the kids, we're gonna carpool, we're gonna have them ride in the pastor's cars. That's fine. But if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that everyone who is going to be in that car is authorized to drive that car. For example, are they licensed? Did you have the parents say that this is okay? What vehicle are you using? Are you going to use your personal vehicle, or does your church happen to have its own vehicle, maybe a van that you can use? These are just things that if you're going to have an event and it's church sponsored and you always want to use the church van for your event, that's fine. But that's just something that you would want to put in your policy. And again, insurance, and again, we'll be talking more about insurance here in July, but who is covering in case of an accident? Is it going to be the personal insurance? Or is the church going to take out an insurance policy to cover any accidents that happen on these trips? These are just questions that need to be asking. Also, pastors, you travel. When you have to do a hospital visit, you leave your church building and you go to the hospital. That's a work function. So if you're traveling, or is the church providing an insurance policy to cover you, or are you on your own personal policy? That's just something for you to think about, and to make sure that in your policies and procedures that you're addressing that when you do work for the church, and you should probably define what that work is, who is going to provide you coverage in case an accident does happen, because accidents do happen. And again, are you acting within your scope of work? So again, these are policies that you can put in place to help you define what is within the scope of the work. Driving to the hospital to pray with a congregant, that's within your scope of work. Driving to the grocery store to pick up dinner for your family, probably not within the scope of work. And that way it's important to know which insurance policy will be covering that.
Okay, we go to the next slide. This is on missions. And this should be near and dear to everybody, because that's a large part of what a church is about, is engaging in missions. And missions, as you know, can be in your hometown, it can be in your state, it can be international, or anywhere in the country. Missions can occur wherever God leads you. But there are aspects to it, definitely there are legal considerations. And we just listed a few of them here. But if you're engaged in missions, and we're talking here particularly about going on mission, but missions can also include hosting a mission team that has come in to visit with you. And that's a little bit different than what we're going to focus on now. But in terms of going on mission, insurance becomes a significant factor. And you need to be sure, again, that your insurer knows what your plan is and what the project is and where you'll be going. We've got some churches, for example, under our state-to-state partnerships with the churches in Georgia. We've got 2 or 3 churches that are going to be sending teams to Georgia. Well, you need to have your insurance look at that and say, we are covering you, or we're not covering you, or what will be done, and even make recommendations as to how you handle things. So insurance will be very important, but particularly if you're going overseas, and some of the policies there deal with if you're in a foreign country, what happens if you're hurt? What about medical evacuation costs? What about being stranded there? What, in terms you can't get out? There's a lot of factors that can come in when you're traveling internationally. So you have to be on the alert as to what that means. And particularly by the fact that as you are in a different country, you are under that country's laws. And you have to be aware of what those are. My recommendation is, if you're going overseas, make sure you contact the State Department. What's their paper on that country? What are their cautions on that country? Who do you contact over there? Now, that's not insurance, but it's a legal thing in the sense of who's going to be responsible for what. And if you haven't provided for all these things, can the church be held liable for what happens to a mission team? We had an incident a few years ago involving some college students that came out, and they were up in the Yellowstone area. I believe it was Yellowstone, and they were on mission there, but they took a day off to go traveling, and they traveled away from the Yellowstone, away from where they were working, and they had an accident, and several were hurt, and there was a bad thing, and they filed a lawsuit, and basically the court said, Since you say a missionary is on duty all the time, that means wherever they went, they were on duty, and therefore you're liable for whatever happened to them. So what's that say? Be prepared with your insurance to cover that. Be prepared to have understandings of what the scope of activity is going to be with them, what's authorized and what is not part of their duty and their calling. So foreign requirements, we've looked at that. The next one is minors. People like to take their children with them. Now, I was fortunate enough, I had occasional one trip to take my children, but they were adult children. But minors, you need to be sure you have the right paperwork showing, things like birth certificates, the fact that you are the parent. You need to be aware of what, in terms of medical needs. But what happens if it's somebody who's not your child, it's another child? What authority do you have over that child? What are you empowered to do to gain medical treatment for that child if needed? What happens if that child acts up and you get down into a discipline issue? What happens if you want to send them home? There are a lot of things like that you want to be sure you cover, and it is clearly understood by the parents and the team leaders, because not all mission teams will have the pastor with them. So you get down here to leadership, and that's another element down here. The leaders have to know what their authority is. They need to know who comprises the mission team, and they need to know the specifics so that if a child has an allergy or an adult has an allergy, an adult, you take a senior citizen on mission, could be a disaster relief or whatever. That person may have a heart attack, a stroke, whatever. How do you handle that? And you've got to be prepared as a leader to address it. Now, what can they do or not do in the name of the church? That's kind of what we've been suggesting here. If you go, for instance, you're going down to Florida on a mission trip, all right, and someone says, I want to go see the Space Needle in Washington. Let's take a little shortcut and go up there. Well, that's not part of the mission trip. That's an exaggeration, but you can get into situations where they say, let's take the day off and do something that's unrelated to the mission. So part of it is, are they still a mission team? Are you still responsible? What's covered? Hotels and food. And this happens. You take a bunch of teenagers on a trip, they get in a nice hotel and they want room service. Who pays for room service? You have to have some limitations in the deal or hotels you're dealing with. If you're going to give a food allowance, that's one thing, but who's paying for the hotel? Who can charge what? Those are things that you need to have involved. And then the other thing is the composition. And the challenge here can be with the church is that you're putting a mission team together to go to, say Cuba. All right, you're going to put a team together. All right. Who should be the composition of that group? Who should not be part of that? And what you want to be sure of is that you're checking who is going. For instance, if you have an expatriate from Cuba, he may be going for political purposes, not for mission purposes, or it could be anything, But the thought is make sure that the composition of the mission team is consistent with the nature of the mission and the location to where they're going. Sort of a humorous situation happened a few years ago where a team was taking a youth to the country of Wales and on a mission trip. So they had mission t-shirts built up saying, "Save the whales." They got off the plane and that was not well received by the Welsh people, let alone the Welsh Christians who had them over there. You'd be aware that your shirts, that you're wearing the shirts, may be giving the wrong idea, the wrong notion of who you are or what you're about. Internationally, it can also make you a target. Get the kids with the yellow shirts, for example. So with missions, yeah, there are legal aspects. And again, in the long run, you want a mission to go well. So look at all the expectations. And that means if you're planning a mission in May, you're behind the curve and getting ready for it. You'd be thinking ahead, particularly if you're overseas. Plan way ahead, review with people who've been on mission, but look at there are legal aspects with it.
All right, next one is employment. Employment happens all the time. Pastor, you may actually be an employee of your church. So these are just things that, again, we recommend you think about so that way you have an idea of What are the expectations for people who you are going to hire? And then what are their expectations when they're working for you? And then what are the expectations when you unfortunately have to let somebody go? With hiring, it's what are the qualifications to hire somebody? If your church decides that the pastor is an employee of the church, do you have those qualifications written down? Are you making sure that you're citing to the biblical texts? Are you making sure that when you're interviewing the pastor that they meet that biblical text? If you're not, then you're just opening yourself up for a pastor who is not fit to be in your pulpit. Again, a policy and procedure, these things, they will outlive you. So if you have that written down, that your congregation must find a pastor who is going to fill the pulpit and speak biblically and be qualified under biblical terms, then they have to carry that out. And it helps keep them accountable, keeps the pastors accountable, keeps your congregation accountable. And same thing with firing. What are fireable offenses? Is it something where the pastor may say something that you disagree with? I sure hope not, because we're all human and we all maybe say something that we don't all agree with. But if it's something that is extremely flagrant, maybe that is a fireable offense. So you having it laid out what must happen to fire somebody is important. Same thing if you're supervising. Pastors, are you in charge of supervising your deacons, or your deacons in charge of supervising somebody else? The policies and procedures can help outline who's supervising whom and who has to report to whom. And same thing with trainings. Make sure that you have in there all the trainings that you want your people to take. They should be taking trainings on anything that you think is relevant to carry out their duties, but also on sexual harassment and discrimination, which are the last two here. Sexual harassment and discrimination policies. You may not sexually harass somebody, you may not discriminate against somebody, but what happens when someone who you employ does? That's why these policies are there, right? It's not always just about protecting you, but protecting others as well, on making sure that people who maybe claim that there is discrimination or sexual harassment, but that there is a mechanism in place for them to be able to say that safely, and for you to be able to investigate and determine whether or not this is actually occurring. And if it is, address it. So again, these are all things that you can put in a policy and procedure as it relates to employment within the church.
The next slide deals with land and facility use. And like so many of the topics we talk about, we're only kind of brushing the surface on this, but as we look at your facility, facility would be your building and the land that it's on, which would include parking lot. Who can use it? Of course, you want to use it for your church activity, but we're talking here about third parties coming in, or even church members. They want to have a wedding there. They want to have a party there, anniversary party or whatever. Schools might come in. Homeschoolers frequently will lease property to come in. You have scouts that may be there, that they're guests. And these, what we're looking at here are not necessarily church events, but they are events on the church property, and it may or may not involve church members. So as you look at that, there are some real basics to consider. Weddings is one that you want to be sure that weddings in particular, that you make it clear in your documents, your policies, or any written understanding if somebody wants to do a wedding policy would be a great place. That there are certain weddings, such as same-sex marriages, you're not going to allow to be done on your church property. And so that'll be another topic we'll talk at a different point. But the thought is screen who's coming in. And it's not that you shouldn't have outside parties. AA often will use the church, or other groups, have scouts, like say schools. There are groups that can come in. You need to have some clear understandings with them. And this is where it's important to have some things in writing. Here are the things that we expect you to do or not to do. One of this, don't do anything that's inconsistent with the beliefs and purposes of the church. Okay. If you are leasing the property and charging for it, then you've got to be sure you're clear on the terms of that, and also that you're not jeopardizing your tax exempt status as property if it's being used for commercial rather than religious purposes. Now, if it's being used for something that's educational or charitable, you can come in, but just be sure, for instance, you don't want to sponsor necessarily an Amway convention there and charge people for it, because that's clearly not within the church's call. But make sure you know who's using it. And then within that, who's responsible? Who's the entity? Is it just an individual? Who's going to sign the paper? And what will that paper say? Such things as what happens if there's damage? What happens, whatever sort of thing that could go wrong. You want to make sure that it's understood what they can or cannot use. For example, if you have since Mountain View, I'll use Mountain View, they've got a multi-purpose room where people can do things. And you say, all right, you can use that room, but you cannot use the rooms down that wing. You can only use that area. And here's the entrance you can use. So you want to be specific on those things. You want to know if that use is going to be covered under your insurance policy and what the coverage will be. And then you want to know what insurance the people have that are coming in, if they have any, and you want to be aware of that. And if they do have policies, it depends on the event, and they can get event coverage, policies. Make sure the church is named as an additional insured. So if something happens there, there's that ability to have some coverage. Look at community events and church sponsored and non-church sponsored. We had a big event this weekend up in Layton that was Dog Day. A lot of people came, a lot of outside vendors, but it was well thought out. It was well planned, documented. People signed agreements, what they could or could not do. There was oversight to make sure they stayed where they were supposed to, and it went well. But if you're having a community event and it's not a church sponsored and you don't have that control, make sure you have documentation and clear written understandings of what's expected by the parties. Hazards. This is a thing that every property has a hazard, and every use will have a hazard. It can be a simple thing as you have some kids together and someone leaves stuff in the middle of the room where they're running around, or they move a chair out, or you have a hole in the ground out in the yard. Well, what the law is going to say is if you knew or should have known that there was a hazard and you did nothing about it and somebody got hurt, you can face liability. That can happen. Main thing is you want people to be safe. So you check the premises to be sure, are there any hazards that we need to alert these people about? Some churches will have stairways, stairwells going up, say, to a balcony or a second floor. And sometimes they're not well lit. Sometimes the carpeting on them is loose. Sometimes the board may be loose. That's a hazard. Inspect the premises before. And if you don't repair those, at least put a warning up to them, give them a warning. Don't step on that step, things like that. So you want to take care of the hazard. Parking lots, what happens frequently, depending on location, there are people who are commuting, they want to use parking lot to meet at or leave the car while they catch the bus and all. It's up to you how much you would want to allow that or not. But don't assume that just because the car parks there that you're liable for whatever happens to that car. You are not liable for what happens to that car unless you drive into the car and crash into it yourself. But that's not because it's parked, it's by itself. But churches will hold back on that. If you're worried about that, just have a little thing telling somebody, hey, you want to park your car here? Just sign this. It's a waiver that we won't hold you responsible for what happens to our cars. But for the most part, you're not going to be liable simply because they park it. However, you want to be sure that your parking lot is well lit, that the parking lot is marked, people know where they can park, where they should not go. Entrances are marked, and if you're going to be having nighttime activities, that there's a light to say where the entrances are, and this is out, this is in. So you want to just be sure that that your parking lots are in good order that way. And all the things we're talking about really is a common sense approach to saying, we care about you, and our mission is to serve Christ. That's what we're about. We're not operating a parking lot. If you want to get into a commercial use, that's a topic for another day.
All right, I know that we're already at our hour. This is our last topic. So it's pastoral care. So you as the pastors, you have certain duties that you perform for your church. For example, maybe you offer some counseling. And if you're offering counseling, what are the rules and requirements of that counseling? For example, does your church require that your counselors be licensed? Maybe, maybe not. If you do require licensing, what sort of licensing are you requiring? Are you requiring a psychology degree from a university or master's, or can a biblical counseling school suffice? Where is this counseling going to take place? Is it going to take place in people's homes? Is it going to take place in the office? Each place has its own traps, right? If you have someone coming to your office and you close the door and you think that you're safe because you're in your office, all it takes is that person saying that you, pastor, did something while you were in your office with that person. So maybe your office isn't the best place. Maybe it is, and you just need to have some sort of safety mechanism put in place to make sure that you're holding that person accountable as well as yourself. Again, it's the same thing with the home, right? If you're going to somebody's home, what are you doing to make sure that you protect yourself? What are you going to do to make sure that it doesn't look improper? Part of this is coming down to the next part here, gender. Should men be counseling women? It's a hard topic, right? Because our pastors have to care for everybody in the flock, regardless of gender, male or female. But if you as a male pastor are going to a single woman's house to give counseling, and you're doing it every week and you're going to her home, it's going to look bad. And there's an image problem there. So it's not necessarily that it's bad, but maybe you need to come up with a better way. Maybe it needs to be your counseling is going to be in a public place, or maybe it's going to be, again, at your office. This may be where an office makes sense, where the door can be open, or it'll be filmed, or whatever it is that you need to do to protect yourself. And the next thing is recordings. You can record. You can record it. Make sure that the person that you're counseling knows it's being recorded. But otherwise, you can record your counseling services, and that might be something you should require. And then the last thing is ethics, right? What are the ethics of counseling? I'm not trained in counseling, so I can't really speak on the ethics. But if there are ethics to that to counseling, make sure that anybody who is counseling in your church is also following those ethics, right? Again, this could be a pastor, this could be a deacon, or somebody else that you're bringing in. Just make sure that they're following any ethical rules that are being applied through that profession. Clergy privilege. We'll be doing a big talk on clergy privilege, but basically a basic understanding of clergy privilege is that if someone is coming to you as the pastor and is saying something that they believe is in confidence, and you, pastor, say nothing, that is creating a clergy privilege. So if they're saying that they are violating the law in some way, and you do not tell them that there's no privilege, they have the right to invoke that privilege and stop you, pastor, from telling the police or taking the stand against them. So it's important that the clergy privilege can be an important thing to have, right? If you're counseling a married person and they're struggling in their marriage, you may want to invoke that confidence, but you may want to also put in lines, right? If someone tells you that they're a child abuser, you want to be upfront prior to them saying anything and saying, if you tell me that you're abusing children, I will not protect you. That is not under my privilege, and I will not protect you. That is something you can say. But again, if you say nothing and the person believes that they're talking to you in strict confidence, that privilege is going to apply. So make sure that you are handling that privilege properly. And again, we'll go more into that because the clergy privilege is something that is a hot topic right now, given what's been going on. Marriages. Pastor, what is your policy on marriage? Besides the fact that hopefully it's a biblical man and woman. My pastor will not conduct a marriage on behalf of the state. Maybe that's what you would like to do. Maybe it's not. But having those clearly defined rules will help you in maintaining your congregation and helping you to instruct people about where you stand and what your beliefs are. Same thing with funerals and hospital visits. What are the rules as far as what the church is willing to do on a funeral, or what are they willing to do at a hospital visit? Do you do last rites? Do you do a baptism there? If you're going to be doing a baptism at the hospital, what must it look like? These things are just all little things to be thinking about, and when you're crafting your policies and procedures. And all this really just falls under that ministerial or church role. And then what can you delegate to others, right? Pastors, you really shouldn't be delegating your pulpit, but maybe you could delegate something to your deacons, right? And telling your deacons, hey, can you guys take care of communion? This is something, again, the policies and procedures you can put into policies and procedures so that way everybody knows what their role is within the church. Lastly, document. Right? If you're documenting all of this, right? If you have an agreement with you and the person who you are providing care for that says, I'm going to provide you care in this way, or counseling really, and again, like maybe making it very clear in there what the confidentiality is going to be, that is a great way to document the expectations. Or if you're getting called out to a hospital visit, document what was said. You don't have to share it, but you can keep it confidential, but write it down. Because if it's a written document, it's going to help you remember what happened. And two, if someone does say, well, you said something, it's, well, no, I wrote down what I said. And this is what happened. So document your actions is a great way of protecting yourself in case somebody sees an opportunity to try and take you down because they're after the church, right? So with that, that is the end of our presentation. And again, I just want to stress, and I know it sounds like we're making a lot of rules here, but that's not our goal, is to make a bunch of rules. Our goal is to make sure that the church can thrive and that the church is protecting itself, because there are wolves out there who are looking to get into the church and who are looking to sabotage the church and take us down. Policies and procedures are not going to protect you from everything. They're not. Only Jesus can truly protect you from everything. But these are ways that you can help build your church to make sure that everyone knows their expectations, knows what it means to be a member of your church, to be active in your church, and to help pastors know what their roles and duties are in the church and serving Jesus. And that's the ultimate goal. Is we just want to make sure that we're giving you the ways to try and avoid as much of this world, the negativity, the evils of this world as possible, so that way you can do your job, and that is telling people about Jesus Christ.